Well, I heard part of that introduction, at least enough to know that I'm welcomed here in Missoula. And it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that I always like to come back to Missoula. I taught here for a semester in 2001, and I very well remember this day in 2001, because I was in the middle of one of my classes here at the University of Montana. A student come in and said they've blown up the World Trade Center. And we, for the next few days, were in just sort of disarray, trying to figure out what we would do with our classes, what we would say to our students. It's a very agonizing time. But I'm much encouraged when I can see 4 years later the vitality, the energy, the single-mindedness to come back from a disaster like that. And I think that's what marks the American spirit. Now here we are facing another similar disaster 4 years later in another part of the country. And I think the same spirit will come back to us. I think it's the spirit that galvanized the Corps of Discovery, that made them the partnership, teamship that they were to have this magnificent journey across the continent. We come tonight to commemorate that expedition in many ways, but the one commemoration I want to bring tonight is a little different. Not so much words of glorification, but try to bring words of understanding about the expedition in a way that I hope may be somewhat new or novel to you, but in a way that I hope will generate interest among you and perhaps questions. And we can have a short discussion at the end of my talk and look into these points a little further. Well, my family has ceased to be amazed nearly when I come home and I say, you know, this reminds me of Lewis and Clark. It will be the strangest sort of occurrence, and they don't think it's too strange anymore whether I see a book or read a book or see a play or something and come home and talk about the relationship between that event, that occurrence, their episode, and Lewis and Clark. And they just say, oh, there he goes again. I'm sure some of you experienced that. But they were really amazed a few years ago when I came home and said, well, I just saw a movie that reminded me of Lewis and Clark. And they said, well, what movie is that? And the eyes are rolling. Spider-Man 2. Now, you may be curious how I drew a parallel between Lewis and Clark and Spider-Man 2. And that's what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes before I launch in more deeply to my subject here. It was an age after World War II and in the decade before, during the Great Depression, when Americans were facing some of the same crisis, only greater than we have with the World Trade Center and the Pentagon bombing and the problems in New Orleans now and in Iraq. And these people of that generation, which have come to be known as the Great Generation, when they looked for a hero, some superhero, many of them found this man in Superman, a man who had all of these abilities and, you know, faster than a speeding bullet and could jump tall buildings in a single bound, and you know the whole phrase in there. He was a hero who spoke to their age, an age in which they had worries about the future. Will we overcome this economic crisis? Will we turn back fascism? Will we regain the strength and the glory that we had before Pearl Harbor, before this great economic crisis? And Superman answered those needs. He was a man without doubts. He was a man without problems or difficulty. He simply would come in and take care of whatever problem seemed to be there at the moment. His only weakness was to something foreign to all of us and foreign to him. And he had no weakness otherwise for any of the things that bother the most of us in day-to-day life. What about Spider-Man 2? Here's a man who has anxieties, deep disturbances. He questions his abilities, these powers that he has. He's unsure of them, that he's using them the right way or for the right purpose. And in fact, in Spider-Man 2, he turns away from those completely and decides he wants to live a normal life, to have a girlfriend, to have a wife, to live the sort of mundane life that most of us do. And so he's willing to turn away from those because of the deep anxieties he has about the powers that he possesses. And so I see in Superman and in Spider-Man 2 a sort of a metaphor for our own look at Lewis and Clark. That the generation of the 30s and 40s and 50s saw them as these superheroes, men who didn't have difficulties, who bestrided the continent without anxieties or difficulties or troubles. And we hailed them not only as heroes, but our great American heroes. And they stood for that age in glory and in honor. But now we begin to question the men of clay feet. They have their problems. And I think this shift from the superhero to the anxiety-ridden explorers says as much about our own age as it does about Lewis and Clark. Well, I want to talk a little bit about that, and I ought to bring up some of the biographical information about these two characters so we can sort of look at them a moment and see what we have in this modern age as a new voice, a new look at Lewis and Clark. Well, you know the basic things about Lewis and Clark. I have a friend who said, you know, I've quit giving talks on Lewis and Clark anymore. Everybody knows too much. Well, I'm the fool who keeps giving talks on Lewis and Clark, and hope you'll forgive me if I tell you things you already know. Lewis was born in 1774 in Virginia, not a great distance from Jefferson's Monticello. Jefferson watched him grow up as a young man. He admired this man. The Jeffersons and the Merriweathers and the Lewises had been friends, or the families had intermarried over the years. Well, you know, his first name, Merriweather, comes from his mother Lucy's maiden name. I always thought that when he was in junior high, he must have had real problems with that first name. That caused a lot of fights today, wouldn't it, with a first name like that? Nevertheless, he grew up there, got some rudimentary schooling. Jefferson talked about him liking to go out into the haunts of nature. He had a mother who was a local herbalist and would mix up potions for friends and relatives who were sick or ill and needed some care. So he learned these habits of nature and plant life from his mother, and then later in associations with Jefferson, he deepened his interest in the natural world. So Meriwether Lewis grew up in this atmosphere of the outdoor life. Yet he was an elite of his time. He spent some time in Georgia, but then returned to Virginia after his mother's second husband died to care for the home and the property. But he really saw his calling in the military life. He performed the patriotic duty by enlisting in the Army during the Whiskey Rebellion. Came into service and loved the Army life. He wrote back to his mother, he said, I'm loving this life. There are gallons of beer and mountains of beef. Well, these gallons of beer that he was exposed to may have gotten him into some trouble because he spoke uncivilly to another officer and was brought before a court-martial. And at this court-martial, he was absolved of any wrongdoing, but it left sort of a black mark on his career and his record. Perhaps his superior officers thought that he needed to have some time with a senior soldier, someone who was seasoned in the military way. So they sent him off to be with someone who could show him the ropes, give him some discipline and some notion of Army life and rules and regulations and procedures. And so they sent him to William Clark. I'll talk about Clark later, but I only want to say now that Clark was a seasoned officer. He had had time in the military. He was 4 years senior to Lewis, and he had actually faced down enemy fire. He was a front-line Army officer in charge of an elite rifle squad, the very core, the very basic unit of any Army outfit. So he knew what it was to be a soldier. Moreover, he had grown up in a soldierly family. His brothers had all been in the Revolutionary War and had distinguished themselves, particularly his oldest brother, George Rogers Clark. And I'm sure he, at home, heard the stories of their military exploits. And he valued this Army life as well and got involved in it. And he, too, was in the Whiskey Rebellion. And so he was working with Lewis here in this military role as a mentor and advisor. They only met for a few months in the winter of 1795-96, and we know little about that meeting. They may have met once again in 1801, but that's about as much exposure as they had to one another. But somehow they clicked, they came together. They saw in one another not only this friendship that developed, but a cordiality and a mutuality that would serve them so well in so many different ways. And then they went their separate ways. Lewis to the White House eventually, within a year or so, well, not within a year or so then, but within a year or so after Jefferson's election, he was called by Jefferson to come to the White House to be his private secretary. That was his official title. But he wasn't a scribe for the president. He functioned more as the chief of staff, someone who was in charge of White House affairs, who had the ear of diplomats who came to the president, who would set up the president's schedule, who would converse with people before they went to see the president. So he was Jefferson's right-hand person. And Lewis functioned well in this job and was probably looking to, after the completion of the Jefferson presidency and his work here, either going back into military service or probably a career in politics himself. Yet Jefferson read a book. He read a book by Alexander Mackenzie, a Canadian who worked for the Northwest Fur Company, about his trek across the continent in Canada. It was one of those lightning bolt experiences for Jefferson. And he thought that now the United States had to take up the challenge to this group of people who were pushing into the Pacific Northwest, and the competition for empire was on. And for the United States to be a player in this game, the United States had to get someone out there to plant the flag and say to the rest of the world, we're in competition with Russia, and Spain, and France, and England, Canada, for this area of the Pacific Northwest. Now, it was always sort of the staple of Lewis and Clark enthusiasts that Jefferson called Lewis to the White House to prepare him for this expedition. And there's phrasing in this letter requesting him to come that led them to this conclusion. Now we've changed our minds on that, and we see that he had other purposes in mind, and the truth is that he really didn't get excited about Western exploration until after Mackenzie's book came out, and that was a year into his presidency or more. So why did he call Lewis? Well, we know that he admired him. As a young man, he'd seen him grow up there. He admired his military work. And remember that Lewis's military work had not been as a frontline Army officer like Clark. He was an administrative officer. He carried dispatches, took payrolls around. He had traveled throughout the American West of that day, the Ohio and the Tennessee valleys, and had come in contact with the whole of the officer corps and was well acquainted with the officers from the first rank down to the lowest and newest shaved-tail lieutenant in service. So Lewis had formed administrative duties, so he was, again, a natural for this administrative job. But there's another element here, and it gives us that first little crack in Lewis's shield of heroism. And that is that a document was discovered a number of years ago in Lewis's handwriting in which he made a list of all the members of the officer corps. And beside each name, he had a cryptic comment laying out their political affiliation. Lewis was a spy for Jefferson into the politics of the officer corps. Jefferson and the founding fathers knew from past experience and the reading of history that republics like the United States failed because of military coup d'etats. Jefferson was a fine student of history, and he called his election of 1800 the Revolution of 1800. It was a turnover. It was the first time that a government had been supplanted, not by revolution or revolt or coup d'etat, but by a free and democratic election. And here Jefferson was president, but only president by a slight majority. And he worried about what the officer corps might do in a situation like this. And so Lewis could provide him with the details that he needed. I don't think that Jefferson was making a Nixon enemies list here or anything like that, but what he was doing was trying to know who he could count on in a crunch. So he wasn't trying to get to them, to demote them, to fire them. Nothing like that occurred, but at least he could be watching his back if anything started to happen. So this is the first inkling we have of what Lewis was brought to the White House for, not a Western expedition, but as an administrative assistant and someone who was familiar with the officer corps. I'm not going to talk much about the expedition itself. We know the stories of the expedition so well. And what I want to point to is what happened to Lewis afterwards and all the matters after the expedition that have caused us to change our thinking about who Meriwether Lewis was. I'm only going to mention one thing on the expedition because it looms so large to this statement of Lewis being in difficult situation, emotionally drained, mentally fatigued, and in difficulty after the expedition. And it's a story that I'm most familiar with, and it's one of his journal writing. We all know that he was charged by the president to keep a journal of the expedition. Clark was not charged with this. Lewis was charged with this. And so we have to wonder, why are there such great gaps in Lewis's writing? Well, the greatest gap is right there at the start. From May 14, 1804, when the expedition began, until April 7, 1805, when they left Fort Mandan, Lewis had not written a single word of daily entries about the party's events during that time. Well, he had a few random writings that he sort of filled in at points, but no regular daily journal writing during this period. I think I've come up with what I think are sort of explanations for this first period, and I'll just give them to you briefly. They were going through a territory that was well known. They had French boatmen on board who could name the rivers they were passing. They had maps by John Thomas Evans, an explorer a few years earlier. They had a journal by James Mackey, who was also an explorer. They had all sorts of knowledge gained and gathered in St. Louis about the first 1,500 miles of the trip up to the Mantans. And so Lewis may have felt it's not necessary to keep a daily journal here, and I will simply content myself with my scientific work and let Clark take care of the routine writing. Shared labor. And I think that explains some of the other gaps in his writing. Shared labor. I'll do the scientific work. I'll take the longitude, the latitude. I'll describe the plants and animals. I'll put together materials for that matter, and you do the routine writing. Shared labor. But that does not explain that after they left Traveler's Rest, and by the end of August of 1805, Lewis quits writing and does not take up his pen again until January the 1st, 1806. How do we account for a gap like that during a place that is so critical to the expedition? Well, the first explanation most people have for any gaps is lost journals. And that's something that people always want to jump to. I'm always reluctant to move to that position because I see that they've written so much and they're doing so much during all the expedition. How can we lay on them more writing than we already have exposed to us today? Here might be an example of lost journals. I think lost rough notes of scientific writing, if nothing else, because when he does start writing in January of 1806, he writes lengthily and skillfully and in depth about the whole ecological system of the Pacific Northwest. All the plants and animals, all the terrain and environment that he's seen from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Coast. Where is he getting that information? It's just beyond me to believe that he could have remembered all of that information that he writes out so lengthily during that last months at Fort Clatsop. So there I would say there's a possibility of rough notes being lost. But I can understand other gaps here and there, and I can't always get the explanation of rough notes. I have to say Lewis failed to keep a journal when he was supposed to. The most glaring example of that is when he was coming down the Ohio and he met Clark in October of 1803, and he handed over the notebook he had been keeping a journal in and let Clark start writing in it. Why did he quit then? Here's a man who was hired to be a writer, who was commissioned, who was ordered to be a journalist, and he was not doing it. It's just incredible to me. And the answer beyond lost journals and shared labor is the answer that people have begun to come up with in recent years. Mental, emotional difficulties. And this is what I want to turn to now, this subject. After the expedition, Lewis had problems, many problems. First of all, he was unlucky in love. He went back to the east after the expedition and began to write friends about women that he was courting or seeing or visiting and wondering about this woman or that woman. Yet he never connected. He never came back to St. Louis with a wife. He came back a bachelor. And so maybe his difficulties were such that women saw something in him they weren't interested in. You would think that he would be the catch of the season. Here's the astronaut returning to the earth, that every woman would be interested in this man. Well, of course, telling them that he's going to take them back to this little dirt town in the west called St. Louis didn't interest them very much. St. Louis wasn't the thriving metropolis that we know now. It was nothing but a frontier little army dirt town, more or less, and that was the life that he was taking them to. But maybe they saw something else. These emotional or mental problems that people have talked about, and just didn't want to have a marriage with him. So he went back to St. Louis a bachelor to take up an administrative job that maybe he wasn't prepared for. He went back to live with William Clark in the apartment that they had established. But Clark, in the meantime, had married himself a girlfriend that he had named the river after here in Montana, the Judith River. And Judith Hancock then became his young bride that he brought back to St. Louis. And they moved into that apartment, and now Lewis come along to reestablish their bachelor pad. And I think Julia looked at this one moment and thought, I will have nothing of this, and asked him to clear out. Well, we don't know that that happened. I'm just supposing it did. She may be the Yoko Ono of Lewis and Clark. Nonetheless, Lewis now was distant from his best friend, William Clark. He was also distant, not only in space, but in emotional and in other sorts of ways from Jefferson, his mentor. Jefferson began to scold him in letters. Why haven't you written me lately? I've written you 3 letters and I haven't heard from you. And where's that book you promised me about the expedition? Here's the prime graduate student of the major professor. Harry, do you know about this situation? Not getting their work done. Why haven't I had that chapter that you promised me? Get to going and get that chapter in. And Lewis wasn't doing it. Here again, this difficulty of writing. What's going on? He'd written a prospectus. He had promised the world this book about the expedition, but it's not there. He's gone to a job as an administrator. Well, hadn't he been an administrator? Wasn't that his life? But not the administrator in charge. He had always been an aide-de-camp, an underling. Now he was in charge, and he was responsible. And he took on a task that he may not have been prepared for. Maybe he could focus his attention and deal with difficulties when they were all confined within a party of 33 people with a major objective right in his face that he had to keep pointed to. But maybe back in a desk-bound job in St. Louis, it wasn't going to work. He had an administrative assistant who was stabbing him in the back and writing nasty letters off to Washington, telling him what a terrible job he was doing. He started to drink. He may have been taking medication from their medicine chest, and their drug of choice was laudanum. Laudanum is a mixture of opium and alcohol, so you can imagine what this is doing to his system. He had sent a brigade of forces to return an Indian chief to his home from Washington, D.C. That failed and got him into trouble, and so he sent a larger brigade up to make sure this Indian chief got back. And he had accumulated great debts now in doing this. He had to hire these people. They weren't just soldiers. They were a government contract that he had outsourced to civilians to get that Indian chief home. And when he sent the bills into Washington, some clerk in the War Department stamped reject on it and sent it back. Now, in those days, folks, the public official was personally responsible for public debts he incurred. That would change the face of public life today. So Lewis was now in difficulty financially. Maybe that's what caused him to dip into the medicine chest. He was also facing other difficulties in his life. He was also personally financially involved in the fur trade operation, the dot-com enterprise of his day. We hope not the real estate intercom of his day, don't we? Some of us may suffer when that bubble bursts. So Lewis then was overextended. He began to feel the crush of creditors, pushing in, demanding payment. And he thought the only thing to do is to go back to Washington and straighten out my affairs, get the money I'm due from this to pay off my creditors in St. Louis. So he started off to Washington. When he reached the area of present-day Memphis, Tennessee, an officer there jerked him off the boat and held him for a couple of weeks because he learned from people on board that Lewis had twice tried to commit suicide coming down the river. He let him dry out, sober up, clean up, resume his composure, and go on. At a little stand, grinders stand in Tennessee, he took his life. In the backwoods of this little Tennessee road known as the Natchez Straits, trying to make his way back to Washington, he killed himself. There are some people who still believe, very fervently, that he was killed, that he was murdered for money in his possession or for some conspiratorial reasons. I firmly believe that he committed suicide. I'm convinced of that for any number of reasons, but the most convincing evidence for me is that Jefferson and Clark immediately accepted it as suicide and did not change from that determination. Clark was on a trip himself. He wrote in his journal at the time, when he heard this news, I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him. Clark never turned from that. There were rumors that in later years he may have changed his mind, but they're only rumors, and there's no evidence of any strong supporting faction or materials that speak to that point. And the fact that he tried to commit suicide earlier, before he reached that point, is very convincing evidence. The story's changed over the years by those who have had first-hand contact with him in those final hours, but that matters little to me because stories always change from eyewitnesses' accounts. I think the credibility of the people who do invest stands first and foremost, and I believe that Lewis committed suicide. So as Prozac Nation that we are today, how do we speak to Lewis's difficulties? Well, we should be more understanding, shouldn't we? Because we're more attuned and acutely aware of difficulties of a mental and emotional nature. And maybe he had some of those on the trip, and at times he wasn't able to write. But I always thought that other members of the party would have seen some disturbance of some kind. And even if they weren't attuned to emotional difficulties, they would have seen that he was not functioning completely as a captain. I believe he got up every day, he took on his leadership duties as captain of the Corps of Discovery, and took them on and did them well and accomplished his task. So I believe if he had them, and Jefferson said as much, that he may have had them, but he was able to focus his attention and go on. What about that other person, that William Clark, that sure, steady, dependable William Clark? What's his problem? Well, his problem is of a different sort to biographers and writers and interpreters of his life today. He seems like such a straight fellow that there would be no problems. He functioned so effectively on the trip. He complimented Lewis in every way, and he was always there when he needed to be. And after the trip, he took up responsibilities in St. Louis, not only as an able administrator of federal responsibility positions, superintendent of Indian Affairs, and governor of the territory for a time, but also as a family man, a husband, a father, an overseer of a large family of nieces and nephews. And he did this well, not only as a public administrator, but a family man. So there's much to respect in William Clark. What's happened here in recent years is a new look of William Clark as well, and attention is focused on his relationship with his slave, York. Don't know much about York. York may have been about the same age as Clark. It was common for Southern families to designate a young black boy in their holdings of black slaves to grow up to be a playmate with a young son. And that's what seems to have happened with Clark and with York. And so he may have known him from his earliest years as a playmate, a buddy, someone that he just had along whenever he wanted him. So Clark grew up with York and then received him as his chattel property after his parents died. Clark's not only this constant good man on the expedition, he's also this good family man at his home before he establishes his own family. He's the one who cared for his ailing parents. He's the one who resigned his commission from the service and came home to Louisville and Clarksville to care for his older brother, George Rogers Clark. Being the ninth of 10 children and the last son in the family, he had learned to be an accommodationist, I think. Learned to accommodate himself to a large family, and he being the smallest member of that group. And so over the years, he not only accommodated himself to this large group, but became the caregiver for it. So when he was needed at home, it was William Clark, that took on that responsibility. And so when Lewis called him to greatness for this trip, William Clark was at home caring for people and then left them for a couple of years to take on this responsibility. But even from St. Louis, he was concerned about their welfare. After the expedition, as he took up administrative posts in St. Louis, he began to write his family about what was going on with him. His new job, his new life, his new community. And he wrote letters that were heartfelt and insightful. Some 47 letters were discovered in a trunk in a Louisville, Kentucky basement a few years ago. These letters addressed to his older brother, Jonathan, dear brother, he always started them, are heartfelt letters that reveal Clark in a way that we had never seen. You probably know that on the expedition, his entries are short and pointed and very clearly and efficiently stated. It's Lewis that we look to for this emotional outpouring on his 31st birthday. Clark would have never written a passage like that. The official record of the expedition that he was keeping was just that, very official, somewhat official, some would say. But here in these letters we have a William Clark we had not known before, someone who poured out to his brother all the things in his life. And what's interested people most in these 47 letters is his statements about his relationship with York. It began to break down very quickly after the expedition ended. Clark writes his brother, York seems to feel he has a greater importance to me than he actually does. He's getting uppity. I put him in jail last week, and he's been a better Negro for it ever since. I beat him, and he seems to work better now. Here is the man who he grew up with as a young boy. Here is the man who served as his comrade in arms, stood side to side with him, ready to take on any difficulty of the trip. And yet, Clark was treating him like this. Here was a man who was given freedom on the expedition to an extent that he had probably never enjoyed in his life before. A freedom of movement, the ability to carry a weapon, to go hunting. Virginia and Kentucky slaves were never allowed to do that. He may have voted, or at least his opinion was taken, out on the Oregon coast, the Washington coast, when they decided where they were going to spend the winter. And his opinion is recorded just as well as every other member of the party. Every member of the party had a stream, a river, a physical feature named for them. So too York. So he seemed to share in all the common responsibilities of the expedition. So York stands out in the expedition as one of the guys. Yet after the expedition, Clark is treating him completely differently. We don't know what Clark was saying in terms of York, but only from Clark's side. We have no other testimony. We only have the testimony of Clark talking to and writing to his older brother, Jonathan. But the worst comes later. At one point, Clark says the ultimate designation of any slave, and that is, if he doesn't straighten up, I'm going to send him down the river to be sold at New Orleans. This is the worst fate that any black person could think of. They were going to be separated from hearth and home, everything they knew, all their family, all that was comfortable and known to them, and cast into a world that was completely unknown. To be sold on the open slave market to who knows who and to who knows for what purpose. It was a matter that every slave feared to the utmost. As bad as it might be with someone, at least it was a known quality. And here, Clark was willing to cast York away into that situation. It's just incredible and hard to understand. When I first read those letters, I was incredulous. This was not the good man, William Clark, that I knew. The caregiver, the father, the husband, the comforter of Lewis time and again on the trip. The care for the sick and the wounded and the hurt on the trip. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I have to agree with Stephen Ambrose. He said that if the slave institution could corrupt a good man like William Clark, it could corrupt anyone. Well, I know as a historian that I need to not judge Clark based on my own time and circumstance and attitudes, but I have to judge him on his own time and circumstance and what he had been through and what he had grown up and the culture of his time. But I have to also understand that even people in his own age were freeing their slaves, were giving them better treatment here than Clark seemed to be giving York. So I just can't understand what's happening with Clark. I try to put aside my own prejudice toward those types of behaviors, but it's very difficult. So William Clark does stand in judgment for our times against his own times, because even in his own times, there were people who did better, and I think we should have expected more of Clark. Yet again, I have to understand that he's not a man of our times, and that William Clark may have not considered any other way for York. Moreover, I have to try to understand, too, that there may have been difficulties on York's side that simply are not revealed in these letters. I do know that later he did give York his freedom and gave him some money and some materials to help set him up in a wagon trading operation. And then York disappears from history, and we don't know what happened to him. There's sort of a myth or a legend that he went out west and lived with Indian tribes because he had felt such an equal and such a freedom during this time that he returned to those tribes because that was a better life for him that he had knew earlier, and he wanted to recover and regain that life. I don't agree with that. I just can't understand that that would have happened. So I kind of discount that because I don't think there's historical evidence there, and it seems to go against what I think about human nature generally. Nonetheless, we don't know and we can't say what happened to York afterwards, but we do have to give Clark at least some credit for eventually freeing him and helping him out. So what do we come to say in the end about these two men? Well, we try to understand them based on their own time and circumstances. We try to take a historical position and not cast our own doubts and misgivings and our own psychological and emotional difficulties of the 21st century on these 19th century men. But we need to understand them not only as superheroes, which to many people they were, of many generations throughout our history, but we also need to understand them as humans, and that they have the same faults and foibles and difficulties as all of us. And I still respect these men, and I will view them from a higher standing than I do most of the rest of us, because I read so lengthily about the difficulties they had to face. And they're still heroic figures to me, and I respect and admire them very much. I wouldn't have spent 20 years of my life studying these two men if I couldn't find much to admire and respect in them. And I'm sure you feel that way too, or you wouldn't be here tonight. So let's acknowledge the difficulties, let's acknowledge the problems and faults of these men, and go on and acknowledge them as heroes for our own age, and see that many of these things we've said about them say as much about the difficulties of our own times as about Lewis and Clark. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this evening talking about Lewis and Clark. I want to hear now from you a bit. I've been doing all the talking, so maybe we can take a few minutes. I'll get a drink of water here, and maybe you have questions or comments, and we can go on with this discussion. Also, although Lewis and Clark aren't quite 24/7, I'm always happy to stay around for a bit afterwards, and I hope I have a chance to visit with some of you individually. So thank you again for having me, Lauren. It's been great. Yes, sir. Yes, Harry.
Yeah. You were very careful not to use the term depression when you're talking about Meriwether Lewis, but other historians have thrown out that term. I wonder if you know, sir, if anyone has ever done a clinical diagnosis, I mean, somebody who knows the business rather than us amateurs.
Thank you. The question was about Lewis's depressions, and I wasn't careful. I was forgetful. So I would have used that phrase had I thought it didn't come to mind, because I know many people have used that term. I do not feel comfortable with that psychological evaluation of Lewis, because I think most of the people who have laid those sort of categories on him are not qualified in that realm, and I certainly don't feel qualified. Stephen Ambrose, Kim Burns, other people who studied Lewis are comfortable with using that, and I say that's fine. I just don't feel comfortable about those sort of things. I don't know anyone who's done that sort of study, who comes from that field of competence to do that. I'm not sure they could do it anyway. I'm not sure there's enough evidence in the journals. We have to remember that these are official reports that Lewis and Clark are keeping. Moreover, Lewis's writing is diminished by these great gaps in his writing, which make it even more difficult. Most people who tried analyzing turn to this entry of August 31st, 1805. His 31st birthday, August 18th, 1805, when he wrote this sort of introspective passage. But that's a mixed bag too, because he turns around after he's sort of beat himself on the back for a while, he turns around and says, I'm going to do better. So it's not all together revealing of difficulties anyway. I have talked to some people who are psychologists and counselors. I talked to some of our people on campus. Well, I had other matters I wanted to talk about. No, I was talking to them about Lewis, and one of the women said, when I gave this sort of diagnosis, she said, I don't believe a person would be bipolar disorder, which is one of the claims for his difficulty, and could do an expedition for 2.5 years. So that's the closest I've come, and I've heard other people who are in this field deny the possibility that he could function effectively on the expedition and be bipolar.
So the next big book about Abraham Lincoln is going to try to show that he suffered from depression.
That's right.
But the author's thesis is that it benefited his career because he could overcome it and go on to greater things.
Right. The book's just going to be on Atlantic Magazine this month, carries a big article on it. And I thought of Meriwether Lewis. Well, if I could think of Meriwether Lewis from Spider-Man 2, certainly I could think of Meriwether Lewis from Abraham Lincoln. I thought of this very quickly, that would be the same thing that you could lay on Meriwether Lewis. Sure, he had depression, but he got up every day, he went to work, he accomplished his task, marvelously accomplished his task, and then got ready for the next day. So, as it energized Lincoln, it may have energized, or at least made him a better person and more capable leader for them. And I think there was a question here. Thank you, because I'd forgotten about that Lincoln fire.
I wanted to ask you what you think about my thesis about Clark. And that is that when Clark was in the wilderness with York, he was in a different setting. And therefore, Clark did things that he couldn't do back in the setting in Kentucky with society the way that it was. And so Clark was freer. And then when Clark got back, he sort of he expected that maybe he could get away with a little bit more there. But then Clark, when York expected that he could.
Right.
But then Clark was back in the setting in his society, and
Right.
they had, mores and rules of which slaves were treated, and so he had to go back to that mode.
Well, I think that's an interesting theory, and I hope everyone heard that. Did you hear it enough? Because it's a little lengthy for me to repeat. But I think that's interesting, and I've never heard that before. I think that would be more true if Clark were going to live in Kentucky than in St. Louis. So living in St. Louis here in a French and Spanish society that dominated the culture of that community, he would have been less likely to have been forced into a treatment of York because of community standards or cultural prerogatives of some sort. So I'm not inclined to accept that until I know more about what's happening in St. Louis, what the culture there is in 1805. We know what it became, but we don't know what it was in 1805. So unless I understand that, I'm a little reluctant to accept that. I do think that would be true. He might have been forced into certain modes of treating York had he been in Kentucky or Virginia. That would be sure. But that is an interesting thesis. Thank you. Well, there wasn't any debriefing of the Corps after the expedition, as far as we know. Our question was about anything we know about writings or interviews with members of the Corps of Discovery after the expedition. I don't know of any, and I don't know of any statements by anybody. During the expedition, the journal writers were universally praising their officers. Now, we can somewhat discount when Lewis and Clark say, all in high spirits, and some private over there saying, well, you may be, but people grumble, and soldiers grumble even more, So we can't be sure they were all in high spirits every time Lewis and Clark said it. But you only have to read some statements like by Joseph Whitehouse or Patrick Gass, how praising they were of the captains, their care and concern. You can see it in their behaviors. When people were sick, Lewis and Clark would get off their horses and let the sick men ride. They would have never left a wounded, sick, disabled soldier by the side of the road and gone on. There are instances where they cared for people who were disabled and had to be helped along. So I think it shows up very much in the journals and their behaviors themselves and in the praise of the other man. But we don't know, the full story because we have to wonder about the people who were keeping journals. They were sergeants for the most part. Only one private was keeping the journal, Private Whitehouse, to give us the lowest denominator opinion of the expedition, but he may have been the most praiseworthy of the captain. So we don't know the full story on that, and probably never will. I have a question down here.
Yes. You know what? Thanks.
Yeah.
If William Clark were here, he, first of all, he'd mentioned that he inherited that business of slavery. He had inherited, almost 22 slaves. I think he got some from his brother. And he moved them all to St. Louis after the expedition. And there was no room in the household or new households for all his slaves. So he sold, or he rented them out. He said there was a great demand for slaves in St. Louis at the time. And he would probably also tell you that he had mixed feelings about slavery. Upon freeing slave Ben, he wrote that perpetual involuntary servitude is contrary to the principles of natural justice. And perhaps he shared Jefferson's mixed opinions. And I don't think that it would, at one time he wanted to free all his slaves, but I don't think in his position and at the time in our history that he could have. But he certainly wasn't very comfortable with slavery.
Well, thank you for that. I know these phrases, and I know the phrases of Jefferson. I'm sorry, but I find them somewhat self-serving. That he could speak well about how he disliked slavery, yet he needed those slaves. And he needed them for the same reason that Jefferson needed them. Jefferson liked his wine, he liked his books, he liked his good living, and he couldn't have that without slaves. And I think that's William Clark's problem too, that they could philosophically and intellectually speak against slavery, but when it came down to freeing the slaves that made their good life possible, they simply didn't want to do it for one reason or another. So I respect that, but I don't find it fully convincing in the actions that I see these men carry out, and that is Jefferson and Clark. You had a question.
Has there been any work done on long-term behavioral characteristics from the ingestion of the mercury and some of the other opiates and that they had along with them in their medical kit?
Well, there are lots of studies what mercury does to the body and what opium does to the body, so that's fairly well known. And some people have conjectured that this was a part of the debilitation in Lewis. Other people have talked about the opium, the alcohol. There's even one person who said that he had syphilis, and in the tertiary stages of that, his mind became demented, and that's caused his suicide. I'm just not sure of those things. I don't know how to deal with them. I discount the sexually transmitted diseases entirely. Everyone I've talked to, every physician I've talked to, discounts it and gives it no credibility. I just simply don't know about these other medications if the use of the opium and the use of the mercury would have driven him to suicide. I don't know if it could have affected the brain that way. My feeling is, from the medical materials I've read about Lewis, and you know now there are 3 medical books out on the expedition, none of those discusses this difficulty as leading to his suicide. Well, thank you again.